our last speaker for this session. I'm happy to introduce Beattie, who will give a presentation about challenges in translating research in practice for evaluating fairness and bias in recommender systems. The floor is yours. There's some
Okay. No worries. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me for my talk. As Dr. Bauer said, my name is Beattie, and I'm here to talk to you guys about the different types of challenges we encountered when translating research into practice for evaluating fairness and bias in recommendation systems at Spotify. Before going into the different challenges we saw, I'm going to introduce to you guys what the current environment looks like for auditing fairness and bias in machine learning. Then I'll share those types of challenges that we see for industry practitioners when we're auditing recommendation systems. Finally, I'll show how we can come together to help alleviate these types of challenges for practitioners. First, let's take a look at what the current environment looks like when we're auditing AI. As many of us know, the idea of auditing can mean a lot of different things within the research community. But external to our ML practitioner community, the world of AI can seem really mysterious and difficult to understand. This can translate into a fear of machine learning, and this very valid concern has resulted in external calls to action for companies to audit their systems and prevent potential AI harm. The research community has responded to these demands by researching and sharing ethical principles and guidelines for implementing accountable AI. We've been seeing this type of literature since at least 1997, but unfortunately, at the moment, there are no widely accepted industry standards to help narrow down what's helpful and what's not. This leaves a sea of research to sift through for practitioners looking to use these types of principles within their systems. In addition to these types of guidelines, we've also been seeing an introduction of technical tooling to help practitioners implement fairness within their systems. But just because we have that type of tooling doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to meet all of our needs. All of these things combined creates a really complex and intimidating space to navigate, with an overwhelming set of tasks for practitioners to complete, such as translating, implementing, and standardizing research for evaluating fairness in their systems. With this type of complex environment, challenges can really pop up in a variety of ways. We're going to share the types of challenges that we ran into when completing quantitative audits for our systems. We want to share these challenges as opportunities for types of research directions for the RecSys community. When we first started auditing, it was easy to get distracted by all of the different directions we could go in order to complete our quantitative audits. We created something we like to call the SIM framework to help us organize our thoughts. Our framework consists of 4 different steps organized by questions we want to answer during the audit. We also found that the challenges we were encountering also could be bucketed within each of these steps. Our first step is scoping what exactly should be auditing and which aspects we should be prioritizing during the audit. This first step focuses on scoping out what types of harms to audit and even what type of audit to conduct. You'll probably find yourself scoping out quantifiable harms as well as comparison distributions and thresholds for determining if harm is within your system. Scoping harms like this can be difficult since different people have different ways of thinking about fairness and harm. This results in a variety of different directions your audit can take. This becomes even more challenging within a multi-stakeholder recommendation system because you're now looking at consumer versus provider fairness, not even accounting for talking about side stakeholders. And these are different objectives which may require contrasting approaches. Scoping what to audit can be a stressful experience because making a definitive choice of which harm should be prioritized leads to potentially not investigating other types of harm. Making the wrong decision here can have potentially harmful consequences. In addition to this, in many industry systems, there's different types of recommendation models owned by different teams, and a lot of times all of these things work together. You need to understand where your audit is going to fit into this wider ecosystem. Overall, this step can be really time intensive because you don't always know when your scope is good enough. Next, we can move on to identifying the types of methods we want to use to audit what we scoped out. In this step, we're going to figure out how we can measure this type of potential impact effectively. While completing this step, we found ourselves navigating that sea of guidance that I mentioned earlier. We needed to identify appropriate metrics, sampling strategies, and tests for significance to make sure our audits avoided accidentally introducing more bias into the system. Even after finding what types of methods to use, we still needed to test if they would actually work. If they didn't work, it was back to the drawing board and we had to start again. Finally, to make sure that we were transparent with our internal stakeholders, it was really important to share these types of decisions. More often than not, recommendation and ranking fairness metrics are not always intuitive to an audience that doesn't have experience within the area. This communication gap can persist even with expert audiences because of the lack of standardization within the research. So different people have different ideas of what all the different terms are. To showcase the difficulty we found in identifying metrics, we want to look at our experience in trying to measure consumer group fairness. When we looked to the literature, we found over 20 different possible metrics to measure this one fairness context. This is a really important decision since choosing the wrong metric could actually introduce more bias into the system. Without guidance, how can we expect practitioners to know which metric is best for their system and be confident in their choice? After you've scoped the harm and found methods to quantify and test the significance of said harm, you'll want to actually implement everything. Now you're going to be figuring out what the results are. Actually implementing the audit is one of the most technical steps, meaning the potential for technical roadblocks is high. We needed to wrangle our data, translate the metrics into technical implementation, and then actually run all of these methods on our data. Not only that, in large-scale industry recommendation systems, many of these calculations can be computationally expensive and difficult to implement at scale. In order to bypass these two challenges, the auditor who's completing the work will either need to have the type of technical skills to do this or access to engineering resources. Both of these solutions are not always guaranteed, meaning your audit might get stalled at this part. These technical roadblocks all stem from the fact that the majority of popular community-tested fairness tooling do not have built-in support for recommendation and ranking metrics. And most recommendation toolkits don't have support for evaluating fairness. Without this type of tooling, teams will have to build those types of solutions in-house. And even when they release that tooling within their company, they need to educate users on how to use it so they're not introducing more harm when they're trying to reduce it. If your team has successfully navigated all three of these steps, it means that you've successfully completed your first audit, and now you actually have to decide if you should be mitigating the harm that you found. During this step, we found ourselves revisiting our originally scoped thresholds to determine if mitigation was necessary. But the journey didn't really stop once we figured out that mitigation was needed. Now we had to figure out what the right mitigation technique was, sending us back to the identify and implement steps of the framework to make sure that we were reducing the harm in the right way. To showcase how we needed to revisit those thresholds, we want to show that difference between statistical thresholds and practical thresholds. We can look at this hypothetical example where we have two different groups. There's our superstars and rising stars. When we were starting the audit, we scoped out what our representation distribution should be, and we decided that we wanted 45% of our recommendations to be from superstars and 55% from rising stars. When we audited the system, we found that the mean distribution was 48% and 52% respectively, with a 0.5% standard deviation. This is all hypothetical. If we leverage a simple statistical test, we find that our original goal distribution is significantly different. But the question is whether this 3% difference needs mitigation. Now your team needs to revisit their original goals and to create more practical thresholds just in case this 3% isn't enough, or if it is. This question can be intimidating since your group will now need to determine when potential harm becomes actual harm that requires mitigation, which is a really difficult question to answer. In the last slides, I've introduced a lot of challenges, but worry not, because we think that these challenges can be opportunities for the RecSys community to collaborate and produce solutions for industry practitioners looking to implement fairness in their systems. To help produce different types of research directions according to the SIM framework, we found 4 different questions. First, to help with scoping, we think we could explore possible standards to provide practitioners for having difficult conversations when they're talking about harm. Then, during identification, the community can also evaluate current metrics in literature to provide recommendations on what works and what does not work. Third, sorry, we're close to lunch. Anyways, so third, during the tooling, we can help build support for recommendation systems into open source fairness tooling so practitioners don't have to build everything in-house. Finally, we can also research how to gauge when potential harm turns into actual harm needing mitigation. This would really help practitioners approach this challenging question on their own. In summary, we can all agree that auditing fairness and bias in recommendation systems is incredibly hard, but luckily this difficult problem poses itself as an incredible opportunity for the academic and industry community to partner and collaborate in lowering the barrier to accountable recommendations. Thank you so much again for taking the time and waiting with me before lunch. I'm super excited to answer your questions, and if you want to talk after the break, I'm more than happy to. Thanks.
Thank you. Lots of questions are flowing in, so you probably need to look on the platform afterwards to answer them all. What should we start with? Can you elaborate on what types of harm the fairness metrics we're looking at?
Sure. Within this case, we were looking primarily at representation harm, but there are definitely other types of harm you can look at. It really depends on the team that you're working with and what you're trying to measure and the product. There's all sorts of things. So it's not just one harm we're going to measure. Yeah.
Okay. What is your take on how to convince industry practitioners to audit their systems and propose solutions that might introduce trade-offs in their own performance and on other metrics?
Sure. So in our experience, industry practitioners are really excited to be looking into this type of work, but the support and the education that they need to do so is lacking. So it's not really a case of convincing people to do it, it's to support them in going through that process.
But if it would be like a trade-off, like it's the top line metric that the company wants to address, but it would lead to trade, like
definitely. I think in that case, it becomes more of a company discussion where it's really helpful for the company to say that this is something that's important to them, and that will enable practitioners to feel confident in looking into those metrics and mitigating that type of harm.
Okay. Is it important that recommendation systems not reflect biases or not exacerbate biases? Like, should it be like reflecting what's going on? Should it go into a different direction? Because like the world is biased.
Yes.
And that's also the input to the data they have. Should the recommenders like reflect the same thing, what we have? Should it go in? Like how do you decide how do you address that?
So I think we're in a really unique position to be able to try and make the world a better place. And just because the world is biased and life isn't fair doesn't mean that you can't try and make it better.
Okay. Thanks a lot. There are lots of more questions, so please have a look on the platform. This is the end of the session. Thanks all. It's time for the lunch break. And the next session in this room starts at 2, but there's now the Q&A session for the keynote. So if you want to participate online, that's your chance. Thank you.